How about this? Because we've all been there. The student misbehaves again. You've given detentions. You've given different types of consequences. And now you have no choice but to move to some type of suspension. But last time you did an in-school suspension, it was incredibly ineffective. And we all know that out-of-school suspensions just don't work. Hey everyone, Dr. Jones here with another episode of Seeing to Lead. And you are going to love the amount of helpful information offered by Johnathan Cranford in this episode. You see, Johnathan just wrote a book, The Art of In-School Suspension. We all know it, but we don't like to talk about it that much. That our in-school suspensions that are supposed to act as Tier 2 behavior interventions are not effective the way they're currently being practiced. And if they are being effective, well, we can always improve a little bit. You see, the first step to a successful in-school suspension program is figuring out the structure. And I don't mean just physical structure, which is incredibly important, but digital structure. How does work get back and forth between students and teachers? How does credit work? How do students get prepared to enter back into a classroom where they can be productive instead of disruptive because they're not frustrated and they know how to better deal or manage the emotions that they experience? See, in school, we often see our suspension rooms as disciplinary, consequence-based. And while they are, what we often forget to do is incorporate trauma-informed practices because, as Johnathan puts it, they run theirs as trauma-assumed because every student coming in has suffered from some form of trauma. It's incredibly important to remember the nurturing piece required when working with students that we often miss. But that's all explained in Johnathan's book, The Art of In-School Suspension, a discipline program that benefits staff and students. The ripple effects from a positive, productive, effective in-school suspension room are immeasurable. So, you ready to learn more about how to run an effective in-school suspension program? You can find it right here on this episode of Seeing to Lead. If what you hear is valuable, make sure you pick up Johnathan's book and make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. All I ask is for an honest rating and review so that more people like you can hear about these resources. Well, enough from me. Let's hear from Johnathan Cranford and how to improve our in-school suspension rooms so that everyone benefits on Seeing to Lead.
If you just realize that when it comes to their ability to communicate and your ability to communicate, you are in two completely different galaxies, then the crisis or the release of energy that they're having isn't so big. It's such a big deal. But that's where people fall apart, right? A kid resists them or they try to redirect and the kid mouths off to them or gets angry and gives an energized response to the teacher. And then the teacher doesn't know what they're going to do or doesn't have their own response already or understand what's happening in that situation, then that's when they fall apart. And that's when things start to go bad in the school suspension room, right? Or even just a regular classroom, right? Because they're not practicing controlling their emotional response to that student.
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better. Johnathan has 7 years experience as a special education teacher at a therapeutic campus for students with emotional disturbance and 4 more years as an in-school suspension teacher at 2 middle schools. After discovering how in-school suspension programs are failing to meet the needs of our most at-risk students, Johnathan created a successful in-school suspension program to address the current disciplinary, academic, and restorative requirements of our student populations. After establishing successful ISS programs on 2 campuses, he made the decision to create a roadmap for others to follow in his latest book, The Art of In-School Suspension. Johnathan now offers professional development and consulting services for schools looking to restructure their in-school suspension programs in an effort to more effectively impact staff and students. I'm happy to welcome Johnathan to the show today because we all know that in-school suspension programs can be a hot topic, whether people think they're needed or not needed, but overall, you don't typically find them run as effectively as they can be. So Jonathan's going to help us with that today. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. And I'd just like to say that you have the manliest Zoom background I have ever seen. I believe it's probably you doing some sort of blacksmithing, and I'm impressed.
Well, it is. I dabble a little bit, but that is not me. That is my youngest son, who's 14 years old doing blacksmithing. He wants to be a blacksmith and a bladesmith.
Wow, that is impressive. That's really cool.
It's funny you mentioned that. I get more compliments on that background and many of them, are around the idea of, wow, that's a manly background.
It doesn't get any more manly than blacksmith.
But yeah, he was in a shop there. He's got a setup in his backyard that he's actually started taking some orders from people and doing his thing. So it's good stuff.
Awesome.
So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'll pass the word on to him. But, I'm so happy to have you on today because there's a lot of talk around in-school suspension programs and whether they're needed, whether they're not needed, helpful, not helpful. But like I said, when I first introduced you, they can always be improved. And the fact that we've got somebody on the show that has written a book on how to do it, has found success, created a roadmap, I'm really excited about the information you're going to share with people today. So why don't we just start at the beginning? Why this book? What brought you to writing this book?
Well, I had started being an in-school suspension teacher after teaching on a therapeutic campus for about 7 years. So that campus was all kids with emotional disturbance, some major behavior issues, a lot of escalation, a lot of kids going into crisis. And then after I decided I needed a break from that, it's a tough job. I ended up taking an in-school suspension position on a campus my wife was working at. She's the department chair of math department on that campus. And almost immediately, I started getting feedback from the other teachers after I just began implementing some what I felt were common sense procedures from what I learned in my background. And teachers are now approaching me in the hallway saying, hey, my kid had like 4 zeros in algebra in the grade book, and now they're all made up. How did you get them to do that? ? Or they're saying like, wow, my student got more done in 1 day with you than they do all week. What are you doing different? And then they'll also say things to me. This is just year 1, mind you. It's gonna turn into more than this, but year 1, they're also saying, well, the kids are having different conversations about ISS. They're saying that their experience is positive, but they don't want to return. And the way they communicate that is they say, well, Mr. Cranford's cool, but ISS sucks. That's the translation for that. I start, thinking, well, okay, this is good. This is positive. We're having an effect. Then year 2, my district begins to notice. And there's this day where this light bulb goes off in my head because I have about 10 adults in my classroom. And they're adults from my district, and some of them are actually from a neighboring district that we're mentoring on PBIS implementation. One of them is an associate superintendent. And there's as many adults as there are kids in the class. And I'm going, what's happening here? Why am I getting all of this attention all of a sudden? This has never happened in, my, 8 years at that point, or 9 years of teaching at that point. So I start asking questions, and I'm asking them, so are there any other schools that are running ISS the way I am? And they're like, no, nobody's doing exactly what you're doing. And I say, okay. So, well, I'm in the Houston area where tons of districts, 30 districts just surrounding Houston Independent School District. I'm in one of the surrounding districts. And I know people in all of them. My wife's a teacher. My daughter's a teacher. Most of my friends are teachers at the secondary level. So I start asking around. And when you ask people what their in-school suspension room is like, typically you get 1 or 2 answers. They're either going to tell you, well, yeah, our in-school suspension room is a joke. They're, the kids they want to go in there sometimes. They play on their phones, play on their school-issued laptop. They sleep. They it's reinforcing negative behaviors. Or they'll tell you, yeah, I think our ISS room is good. But then when you ask follow-up questions like, okay, well, what's your process for getting work to the in-school suspension room? And they're like, oh, we don't worry about work. He just makes them sit in there and they're miserable, which isn't, that's not school either. So, then I think maybe this is, bigger than all of this. So I do some Googling and research online and I noticed that the studies say that in-school suspension is about as ineffective as out-of-school suspension, which is pretty much zero effective, right? It's not helping anyone. I mean, who are we even pretending to help when we suspend children and we send them home, right? So I realize this is a national issue. It's not just in my little area, in my neck of the woods. And that was when the light bulb went off. Like, you need to write down how you do this effectively and what the steps are. And you need to do it in a way that is somebody can easily follow it step by step, kind of like one of those for dummies books. It's kind of like that. But it's just shorter. It's a pretty short read, and I promise it won't bore you. But that was when I decided to start writing the book. And then this year, we just decided to begin a consulting firm and teach this because nobody else is doing it. No one else is offering, here is how to train you professionally, how to do this, implement this system, which is not intuitive. You're not going to just take your teaching skills, your administrative skills over and put it into the ISS room. It seems like it would be something that's simple, but it's not, right? You would think that everybody thinks they can kind of, just all of a sudden implement an in-school suspension room. It sounds easy, but it's really not. There really is some thought that goes into it. And it's easy to implement once you know what you're doing, but knowing what you're doing is, it's not intuitive. So that's why I wrote the book, the long way of answering your question.
No, that's a perfect answer because you answered in such a way that kind of explains the idea of the need. There is such a need for this. And you and I spoke before I hit record on this, and we were talking about how there are people that say there shouldn't be in-school suspension rooms. And that leaves us with all kinds of questions about, okay, so where, when assistant principals hear that, a lot of them shudder because then they think about where they go with discipline from that in a progressive discipline system. But if it's ineffective, like you're saying, then it doesn't belong in a school because it's not doing any good. It's not helping teachers. It's not helping students. And the idea that you now offer services, you offer professional development, you offer coaching for it is just, the topping because, once somebody reads the book, it's one thing to read a book, but then to be able to implement it, having somebody guide you is always important. Now your book, you say it's a short book, but step by step, it breaks it down as to how we do this. So does it take it from the realization of, okay, we need an effective in-school suspension room and then kind of walk people through the blueprint on how not just to set one up or structure it, because like you said, I think that's fairly simple, the hard when you're looking at what's hard, but then the piece of how you approach it, what policies and procedures you put in place, how the person approaches the students and works with the students in the room. Can you tell us some of that, what your book goes into?
Yeah, sure. That's a lot right there that you're asking.
Yeah. Take it step by step. It'll be all right.
Yeah. I say it's not a terribly long read. It's about 130 pages. And there, we start with defining what an in-school suspension room is and what it is not. And then from there, I talk about the steps to get there. And we start with infrastructure, what I call infrastructure, which is physical layout of the room in order for the kids to be successful, where the teacher sits, are the desks numbered? That helps. And then you've got a digital, what I call digital infrastructure, which is for us a spreadsheet system where how we get work to and from in-school suspension. So how are we getting work from our teachers? That's a big, big deal. And our spreadsheet system works really easy because the way we have it set up is as soon as a child gets in-school suspension, then an email goes out to specifically their teachers. I've seen schools where they just send out a general email to everyone that, hey, there's kids in in-school suspension. Come look at this list. And maybe you have some on there, maybe you don't. If it goes out to everyone, it goes out to no one. That is not effective. That's a big mistake. It just needs to be targeted to, just send it to their specific schedule if they're in ISS. And then it connects in that email. There is a link to a Google Doc, which is just a Google spreadsheet And it's broken down by grade level, by subject. And so where you see the kid's name, you find their subject. If you're the math teacher, you put what the math assignment is for that day right there. If you need to send work, then there's a process for that. But that's kind of the infrastructure that needs to be there before we can do anything else, right? And then I also, from my own, the ISS teacher has their own personal sheet where they're tracking all kinds of stuff too. So it's another spreadsheet where I'm looking at, first it starts out as like a seating chart. And that's why all the desks are numbered. So it's just easy to know who is where at all times and where you're documenting. And then it goes to where I'm tracking work, which is the next most important thing. We're actually tracking assignments all day long and who's on, who's doing what. And then the last is where we're tracking discipline. So if we're having issues in there, we're going to document all of that as well. So that's the main digital and physical infrastructure, and it breaks that down pretty well. And then from there, you're going to go on to actual structure. What are your rules and procedures? What is your procedure for going to the restroom? What is your procedure for going to lunch? All of that needs to be in place before you start the day. And then what we could do is we go into what I call winning the morning. And that's where you go over what your rules and expectations are for the day. And you tell them what the structure is so that there are no surprises. You tell them how you're going to respond to everything. And if you can set the tone right at the beginning of the day and make sure that everybody knows what's going on, you tend to have to deal with a lot less behaviors. It's also what we call trauma-informed in-school suspension because there's no surprises. They know what is going to be expected of them. They know exactly what's going to happen at all times, and they know how you're going to respond. They know when your restroom breaks are. That all of that stuff is handled. It's front loaded, so they understand it. And then also, I mentioned we track work on our spreadsheet. One of the reasons why I do this, because I have kids on different subjects all day long, and that's by design. I give them the choice to choose where they want to start. As long as I can get work from the teachers, one kid wants to start on ELA, we start them on ELA. One kid wants to start on math, start them on math. It gives them some choice, right? So they don't feel helpless. So they can start working and build some momentum right at the beginning of the day, right at first period, as soon as we've gone over rules and expectations. So those two things in combination, we call trauma-informed, right? Those are two foundations of the trauma-informed in-school suspension that we offer. We call it trauma-assumed in-school suspension because we know they're showing up with trauma, pretty much all of them. So, but that's, that's why it's implemented that way. People always ask why. Why do you not just have first period is math, second period is ELA, third period is science? We don't do it that way. We tell them core content first. So we're going to knock out our math, social science, ELA first, but you get to pick where you want to start. Then we do electives last. And then also, within that, you asked me how I'm engaging with students throughout the day. I am always looking for opportunities to work one-to-one. And that's the beauty of in-school suspension, is that you get an eternity with your learners as compared to a regular classroom teacher. And that's where all of the cool stuff happens. All of the academic interventions, all of the one-to-one restorative interventions, all of that happens one-to-one because you have the time if you make it. And that is the real beauty of the work, is getting to work, getting to spend so much time. A regular classroom teacher, 120 or 150 kids throughout the day. They've got like 25 kids at a time for 45 minutes. If a kid gets, an hour of one-to-one time with a teacher all school year, that is a miracle. I've spent 3 hours at a time with my learners, and we backfill deficits that they didn't learn in 6th grade and in 5th grade. We will make sure all those zeros are caught up. We give them momentum going back into the classroom so that they're able to connect and engage more efficiently with their regular classroom teacher.
That's, all of that. You said, I said a lot. There's a whole bunch in that. And one of the things, first of all, I really like the trauma assumed piece where there's no secrets, there's no surprises, and they get choice. So you offer them maximum freedom with expectations, shared expectations, in an environment where they don't typically or necessarily want to be because they're there for a negative reason. Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, Have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community take center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, you don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. seeingtolead.com. But something that really stood out to me, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about it, are the intervention pieces, where you talk about academic interventions and you talk about restorative interventions. Now, as the in-school suspension teacher, are you responsible for both of those? Do you ever have teachers come in to help with academics? Do you ever have counselors come in to help with the social emotional piece?
They're always welcome to. If your school is integrating in-school suspension well, then they will. It tends to be, teacher by teacher. Some teachers will. They're depending on how invested they are in the student. Counselors haven't jumped on board doing it in the ISS room. And what I do is a little bit different than that. Well, it's not that much different. I do behavior reflection, those sorts of things. And we tend to push it towards the end of the day. We'll also do restorative circles sometimes if there's a big enough group. If it's small enough, I like to do more of a one-on-one behavior reflection. But the academic intervention is typically done by myself. I'm the one in there all day. So, and I'm looking for opportunities to do it. So I mentioned I spend 3 hours with the kid. I'll give you an example of something that happens quite often. It happens every year. I'm not a math teacher, but I get to relearn Pythagorean theorem every year because our 7th graders have to learn it. And this is what happens all the time is I'll have a kid who gets in there and, Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We all remember that. So we're going through how to do that. And then all of a sudden we'll get to that problem where they give you a squared and c squared, but not b squared. So now you have a 2-step equation, right? Well, the kid doesn't know how to do 2-step equations. So now we have to go and teach that to them. So we're going back a little bit and teaching that. And then in the course of that, you find out that maybe they don't know how to divide decimals. And so then we go back and we work on that skill. So we can oftentimes work backwards. Even if I don't have information from the teacher, I'm always asking for info from the teachers, saying like, if you've got some deficits, this kid needs work, send it. They sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I can always find them if I'm looking. And then math is not my strength necessarily, but it's easy for us to go back and fill in those gaps if we're looking.
Perfect. Because, how often do we talk about students, their behavior is a direct result of how frustrated or engaged they are or how disengaged they are. And so the idea that, you're, and I'm going to say this wrong because it's clunky, but let me try and get this idea out. The idea that they have the feeling that you care because you do. So now they have that caring and trusting adult that's actually working with them or on their side, for lack of a better term, that they then feel more comfortable. They're engaged in what they're doing. And you had talked about before we hit record how successful you were with getting students to do their work. And the idea that, they didn't like in school. They didn't go back to in school if they could help it, but they liked working with you. And I just think the importance of highlighting that productive type of relationship is super important. How do you, it brings me to the idea of the academics, because sometimes when you have any type of different room where students are doing work, sometimes the teachers, if that student does catch up because that student's behind the 8 ball with the teacher because of behaviors that have gone on in the past, sometimes there's the question of, did the student do the work all by themselves? Do they get full credit? How do you navigate those often choppy waters?
It hasn't been much of an issue. We have grading guidelines in our district, so they tend to get several chances to get non-completed work in. I think most districts are going to that. If there is, though, what I have to be careful is if I see 30s or 20s in their grade book through their, we use Schoology. Some people use Google Classroom, but a lot of times I can see. I want to make those up and, see if we can get a better grade. And we call that grade repair. It's another thing that happens in there. But I have to ask the teacher sometimes because grading guidelines may not allow for it necessarily. But if it's something that is not going to be allowed, then we won't bother with it. But what you were saying earlier is you thought it was clunky. It sounded right, but I call it nurturing. What you were saying, what you were referring to, which is, you set the expectation and the boundaries and you say, look, this is what we're going to accept in here, what we're not going to accept. We're not going to let you fall short of this. But there is so much willingness and desire to help you achieve something today that you're not going to care about those strict boundaries. And that's all that is really. That does build that feeling of, oh, somebody actually cares. And it's something that, sometimes it took me a long time to learn myself what nurturing was, right? That's really what it boils down to. As parents, sometimes we don't understand it. We haven't encapsulated it. Somebody should tell us. It should be a sign that is on, everywhere, reminding parents like, hey, this is what nurturing is. And nurturing is your job. It's our job as teachers as well, right? So that is what we're looking for in an ISS room or any classroom, really, looking for that nurturing piece.
So now it's so good that you talk about that nurturing piece, because oftentimes working with students and your background lent to this more than teachers that haven't worked in behavioral programs and so forth. But that mindset or mentality when you're working with those students, how do you help teachers reach that? Like you give this professional development, you consult, you help people set up these ISS rooms, these successful ISS rooms, or improve what they have. How do you work with them on that mindset and that mentality piece where it's not the same old, but it's also not, just sit here and do whatever.
Right. That's the major issue with in-school suspension rooms, right? That's why I knew what those issues before I even set foot in an in-school suspension room, because I was a teacher. So either you've got the teacher who's given up and they're just letting the kids do whatever, or they're really strict and it's basically a room where kids are sitting there doing time, right? And both of those are 100% loss of instruction. So that can't happen, right? That just can't happen. That helps nobody. That affects the climate of the school. It hurts the teachers. It hurts everybody. So first we start by talking about that. We express, what the in-school suspension room is, what the potential of it is, how it really is the only tier 2 behavior intervention that your campus has. I often tell people that if you don't have a tier 2 behavior intervention, right, then you're just playing school is what you're doing. Because the kids are going to catch on pretty quick that, they gave me OSS where I went home and hung out and watched Netflix all day and played PlayStation, or they gave me in-school suspension where I listened to music and scrolled social media on my school-issued laptop, or I watched Marvel movies on my phone. Neither of those is a tier 2 intervention. Neither of those is an intervention, period, right? So we have to train them to be that intervention because of the ripple effect that's going to have on the entire campus. Mindset stuff is really cool. We get into that's what we call the art. If you get into the later chapter, the last chapter, I guess, we call the art of in-school suspension. It really is more about your ability to communicate and you practicing this art every day. There's a lot of cool things about in-school suspension, right? Which are, you don't have to worry about grades, taking grades home, grading papers, that sort of thing. Everything you're doing is in the room. You're not taking a lot home with you unless it's maybe the stress. You're not worried about entering grades at semester, that big rush that everybody has to do. It's always a big hassle. Grade books, all those things, all these other things you have to manage. You rarely have to deal with parents. So there's some major perks to the position, but you need to be there, when you're there, you need to be 100%, right? So we teach them, this is a practice you have to, that you get to do, right? You actually get to practice not having an emotional response when a student is acting out. Maybe they're cursing at you. Maybe they're in crisis, right? You get to actually practice controlling yourself, controlling your emotions. You get to practice having a non-energized response, what we call it, to that. You get to practice that. So we start thinking mindset right there, right? Like that is something that is a very valuable tool to have as an adult that you can take into your relationships with other adults, with your spouse, right? You need to be able to control the energy of your response and your emotions. It's easy to practice on kids, right? Because they're kids. So, if you just realize that when it comes to their ability to communicate and your ability to communicate, you are in two completely different galaxies, then the crisis or the release of energy that they're having isn't such a big deal. But that's where people fall apart, right? A kid resists them or they try to redirect and the kid mouths off to them or gets angry and gives an energized response to the teacher. And then the teacher doesn't know what they're going to do or doesn't have their own response already or understand what's happening in that situation. Then that's when they fall apart. And that's when things start to go bad in the school suspension room, right? Or even just a regular classroom, right? Because they're not practicing controlling their emotional response to that student. So that's one part of it right there. There are some other steps. We have a whole redirection strategy, a whole ladder to help them make sure that they know how they're going to respond to every situation that's ever happened, because I've already seen it all. So the rules cover a lot. And then when something's going to happen, we already show them how they're going to respond. There's not, it's broken down pretty well. So all you have to do is practice it a little bit. Yeah. What else? I'm drawing a blank on what else we can go into there.
That's all right. When I think about this book and I think about some of the things you're talking about, all the way to the last chapter of The Art of ISS, where you're talking about mindset and mentality and how you work with people with that and give them guidance on that. This is such a huge topic. You mentioned ripple effect, because ISS rooms do have a major ripple effect on the school, whether they're working well or not, and whether you have one or not. What types of ripple effects do you see with a successful ISS program?
Teacher retention, a big deal.
Yeah, that's kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal, right? Having good teachers stay in the profession. That's a fairly important ripple effect, I would say. Let's look at it this way. I'll give it to you from a teacher perspective and an admin perspective. From a teacher perspective, you have some behaviors in your classroom. You're trying. You might be a new teacher. You might have experience. You've got your strategies. You're implementing those, and something's not working, because that happens in every class at some point during the year. And maybe you have persistent negative behaviors happening, and you've gone through all the steps that you're going to take. And now you've got to a point where I need to send a write-up. I need to send an office referral, whatever you guys call it. So you have to call a parent first. Well, at least most districts, that's what my understanding is. You have to do parent contact first, then you send the referral. That's already a lot of work right there that you've implemented. And now, so the kid goes and then they come back. And if they come back from a non-functioning ISS room, now they've come back to the classroom, not only 3 days behind in 1 to 3 days behind in instruction, but also possibly emboldened in their behaviors because they had a good time in ISS, or they liked going there more than they like going to that Spanish class that they hate, or even your class. Just depends on what that behavior served them and how that ISS room served them. So that's how the teacher sees it if it's not effective, and that's very frustrating, right? People get sick of that because they feel like if you have a really rough class, you've got 5 or 6 of those kind of kids in there, which happens very often nowadays. Sometimes it gets to the point where there are days you can't teach. That's extraordinarily frustrating and demoralizing. And I've seen that. And now, from the admin perspective, you've got 1 billion things going on as an administrator, or even as an assistant administrator, where you've got all these things you have to do. You have to do walkthroughs in classrooms. You have to worry about PBIS implementation, whatever projects or subjects that you're over. You have to go in and have so many meetings per teacher for all the teachers that you're over, just to do those evaluations, right? Because you have to have like the pre-assessment, you have to do the actual walkthroughs, you have to do the actual evaluation day. You have so many. Then you have a post-assessment. So if you multiply that times 20 teachers, you're over 100 different little meetings or visits that you have to do. It's probably more than you have days in the school year. And now you've got behaviors also thrown in there, which are going to come at you like every day almost. When the first week of school, they start racking up. It's not your top concern, but it's something you have to deal with. And now if you don't have a tier 2 intervention, so you have OSS and ISS, neither one of which are effective. If the ISS room isn't effective, and then so you just go and do what you've always done, which is assign one or the other. The teachers are getting frustrated, especially if the kid comes back emboldened from ISS. They're not going to blame me. They're going to blame the ISS teacher, right? They're going to start blaming the admin because they're like, why don't you guys have something that you can help us with? They should ideally blame the ISS teacher. They should blame me. In my campus, I don't get blamed because I do a good job, but But that's where the blame should be, right? But it's a structural issue because we haven't had really solid training of implementation of this type of system, of effective ISS room or a trauma-informed ISS room, whatever you want to call it. It hasn't been effective, hasn't worked. So now you've got a tension between the admin and the teachers because they don't have any power to help to do anything better for the teacher. I've seen admin where they're like, hey, the best way I can support you is I'll let you pick. You tell me what you want me to do with the kid. I'll give them ISS, I'll give them OSS. Just you tell me. I've got so much going on and nothing we've done has worked. And I've tried parent contact and the parent's not supportive. So you just tell me what you want and that's the best I can. And that happens quite often. You need a tier 2 intervention so you can stop playing school. Because otherwise we're just playing.
I like the way you put that. And that's what your book, The Art of In-School Suspension, a discipline program that benefits staff and students, discusses. And clearly that's the ripple effect. It's right there in the title, how it benefits everybody involved. So you're not, and again, I like the way you put this, just playing school. Johnathan, we're getting to the end of the podcast here, and I ask guests the same 2 questions on every episode. And I'm interested in hearing what your answers are. And the first one of those is, if you were an educator, who, not what, would you be?
I would still be me, I think.
That's a good start.
I would have less self-knowledge because the kids have taught me so much. And I've learned through this job what my core values are. And that is integrity, humility, and gratitude. And the way that works in in-school suspension, the integrity part is, I always just call it do the next right thing. So I'm sitting there in that room and I can get away with, the bar for in-school suspension is fairly low anywhere you go. So I could get away with just, sitting there and kind of keeping them quiet all day. But the next right thing to do is work with that kid who seems to be struggling or has just been staring at question 5 for the last 15 minutes, right? Even if they don't raise their hand, we call that the invisible hand in school suspension, right? You look for those signs that the kid is not going to ask for help. You just go and bring them to your desk and help them. So integrity, do the next right thing. Humility comes with that redirection strategy. They're going to maybe say insulting things or be hostile toward you. Sometimes you can't take that personally. That is just communication. Their behavior is just communicating frustration or anxiety. They're not good at communicating that. Adults aren't either. So, it's not something to take personally. So being humble, you get to work on that every day. And the gratitude is I get to work with these kids every day. I get so much one-on-one time. I get to practice, not having an emotional response to students. I get to practice making myself do the right thing over and over and over again. That's the best thing that I've learned from these kids and this position.
And so obviously keeping that in mind and some of the other things you said, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to leaders as they work to better support, engage, and empower those they serve?
You got to take care of yourself. I know self-care is probably one of the most annoying topics right now in education, but let me tell you a quick little story. I got into a car accident one time. The guy rear-ended me in Interloop, Houston. And it wasn't like a real bad car. I just felt myself lurch forward. I look behind me and I see like a car rolling backwards with the hood just tented up. And so, but I had been working out, getting, plenty of exercise. I've been eating right and I've been getting plenty of sleep. So I get out of my car and my first thing is I'm like, hey man, are you okay? And I look at it, I have a small dent. He has a tinted hood. I was driving a truck at the time. And I'm like, man, don't even worry about it. I was just in a good place. And it was like, hey, this isn't that big of a deal. It's going to make me a little bit late for my appointment, but I'm not tripping because I'm in a good place. And, in education, our job is to have, or admin, even administration, we have to have 1,000 perfect interactions every day. You can't do that if you have a poor diet, you're not getting enough sleep, you're anxious, you're probably not exercising enough, all of those things. You got to figure out a way to take care of yourself. You can't just preach about it. You actually have to do it.
Absolute perfect answer. I can't think of a better way to wrap up the idea of improving your in-school suspension program so that students can benefit and teachers can benefit. And, as a result, the whole community benefits. So, Johnathan, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I'll definitely link up your book and, let people know in the show notes how they can get in touch with you for the professional development services and coaching that you're offering around this important topic.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you having me again. Thank you so much.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seeing to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrissj@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at Dr. C.S. Jones. If you've gotten any value from the Seeing to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating and review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.